everyone. For today, we're going to discuss our topic in Linguistics 1. This was discussed during the synchronous session as well in the said subject. So, this is linguistics. We start off with our definition for linguistics. So, what is linguistics really? So it is defined as the scientific or systematic study of language, a science in the sense that it scientifically studies the rules, systems, and principles of human languages. So linguistics, kumbaga, is concerned with the structure, development, and other elements of a particular language, and then its relationship as well to other languages. So it's concerned with the form, the content, and the use of a specific language or several languages. So what is the purpose of linguistics? So we have two, that it studies the nature of language and tries to establish a theory of language in the light of the theory established, and that it examines the forms of language in general and seeks a scientific understanding of the ways in which it is organized to fulfill the needs it serves and in the functions it performs in human life. So for example, what linguists kumbaga do or study in linguistics is that they of course study the units, the elements, the components of language, and for example how those elements or components are combined para magamit ang language to function in everyday for communication kumbaga. So paano ba ang mga, for example, ano ba ang ginagamit sa language nga ni nga mga words or units, for example if amo ni ang purpose sang person. Like if I want to ask someone to point me the direction of this place. Ano ba nga mga words ang pwede ko gamiton in order to ask or to relay that message nga nagapamangkot ko and not to sound rude. For example, in the English language, we make use of words like please, can I ask you a question? Can you help me? Ganito, ganyan. So aside from that, the main purpose of linguistics as well is to answer questions like how is a language learned? Kumbaga na ang mga, for example, is our background knowledge in other languages going to affect our our journey in learning another language? For example, if you already speak Filipino and you want to know to learn how to speak another foreign language, makahelp ba ang background mo sa Filipino language in learning the said foreign language or hindi? Do you have to start from scratch or may similarities ba ang language nga i-learn mo sa language nga balaan mo na? So next, why do we need to study linguistics? So to know how languages vary, for example, aside from the academic requirements from this institution to use students, so aside from that obvious reason or for academic compliance as well, so we study linguistics in order to contribute to translation activities. So our studies of linguistics overlaps with our or when we study linguistics somehow or one way or another it overlaps with our personal life. For example, if one of your interests or hobbies is watching, for example, foreign films or foreign TV series or kung ano pa dira, if you like to consume that type of media, so translation activities or translations are very helpful, 'di ba? With the help of course of your subtitles natin. Na without subtitles, our consumption of such media like your foreign movies and foreign TV series like your K-drama, mga C-drama, yung mga Thai na TV series and the like, medyo mahirap siya intindihin if you are just going to judge from to judge based lang sa actions ng mga actors and actresses, for example. Although sa in some way baka pwede tayo makakuha ng message just by relying on their actions. What if yung mga puro convo lang talaga na, ay, ano natabo nga, nag-initay na ni sila. So you wouldn't know because you do not understand what they are saying. So that is, for example, just one hypothetical if we don't have subtitles. A what if, kumbaga. So you can say na translation activities or translations as well as subtitles are a product of studying linguistics. Aside from that, it's also helpful to study linguistics in order to treat or to know about speech disorders and what to do about them. For example, there are people na it's not really by their own accord, or perhaps because of circumstances like na aksidente and the like. That's why they cannot, or they cannot speak normally, or what we consider as normal as the normal for speaking, na kunyari naga-stutter or naga-utal-utal siya maghambal na naga tete, for example, mga ganun, or hindi maka-pronounce or maka-sound out ng mga letters properly. So when we learn about their speech disorders and what causes them, for example, it informs us and enlightens us and prevents us from judging them or discriminating those kind of people. So it makes us aware as well. So for the scope of linguistics, we have two: microlinguistics and macrolinguistics. For this subject, Linguistics 1 or Introduction to Linguistics, we are only going to focus on microlinguistics. So microlinguistics, it focuses only on the details of language itself. So just remember, microlinguistics, ang focus niya sa details lang sang language mismo. Whereas yung macrolinguistics naman, which has the following sub-branches under it sa macrolinguistics, it's medyo, ano siya, medyo broad. So kumbaga, it studies the context in which language is used, applications ng language in different situations and contexts. So for example, for macrolinguistics, we will just discuss this in passing since hindi man amo niya ang focus tagid. For example, social linguistics, it studies or it is concerned with the impact of society on language. So for example, how does a group of people affect the language that they use in the society or the place where they live in? Psycholinguistics, for example, it deals with the psychological aspects of language. Neurolinguistics, it deals with how language is represented in the brain. So for example, ano ba nga mga nerves and neurons ang affected or involved when we are learning a language, kumbaga. So we also have stylistics, which is concerned with the interpretation naman of style in languages. So for example, sa mga writers in literature, na how does it, or how do they differ in writing, or are there similar styles na we did not notice when we are reading various writers' literary works or pieces. So applied linguistics naman, for example, is the real life application naman of linguistics. So going back to microlinguistics na which will be the focus of our subject, ang focus na lang is on the details of language itself. So those details include the following: your phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Sorry. So we have under microlinguistics phonetics, which is the scientific study of speech sounds. So phonetics is concerned with the production of speech sounds by humans, or how we produce or articulate speech sounds. So for example, when we have the small letter A, how is it sounded out? So A. So another, for example naman, this letter, it sounded out as ta. So mga individual sounds, for example, and representations of those letters, for example, in the English alphabet. So that is the concern of phonetics. How we produce speech sounds, for example, how are they articulated? When you say or when you pronounce ba, diin ba na siya ang ginagamit nga parts ng baba? For example, it's your upper and your lower lip in order to enunciate or to pronounce your ba sound. Next, you have your phonology. Phonology naman, which is still concerned with studying how still concerned somewhat with your speech sound, same with phonetics. Ang difference lang, phonology is concerned with with the different patterns of sounds in different positions in words. So it studies the way speech sounds are organized, kumbaga. So for example, when you hear the word or when you see the word na ASH, kumbaga. So when you read that word, when you read those letters as a word, kumbaga, so it's pronounced as ash, kumbaga. But then your S and your H, for example, if you pronounce them individually, di ba, it's a, s, and h. Or when you sound them out, the letters or the sound of the letters individually, it's a, s, h. So mga hindi ang pagbasa is as. So for example, ganon. So the concern of phonology there is that when different sounds are placed together or kung ganun na pattern, for example, if itupad or i-combine ang letter S and letter H, ano na ba nga sound na siya? Will we still use your or iba na ang sound? So for example, for S and H, when they are combined, they produce the sh na sound. That's why we pronounce it as ash. Next, we have morphology. So it's the study of the formation of words. So it is where we break words into morphemes. So it's under this specific branch of linguistics. So for example, this is where we break down words into its base form and its affixes. Na it could be prefix or your suffix, for example, and depending as well kung how many prefixes are there and how many suffixes. So, for example, in the word beautiful. So, in the word beautiful, you have your base form, beauty, and then your affix there, or your suffix to be exact, is your ful. So, when you say beautiful, it means full of beauty. Kumbaga. So, morphology is also considered as the grammar of words. So, in morphology as well, this is where linguists or students, for example, and scholars study the origin or etymology of words. Syntax, on the other hand, deals with a combination of words into phrases, clauses, and sentences. So it deals naman on how we string together words to form phrases, and then ang phrase, paano ba na sila idugtong-dugtong, and ano ba ang correct order to organize them to form a clause or clauses, and how do we string together those clauses in order to form a comprehensible or understandable sentence that is correct, kumbaga. So syntax is the grammar of sentence construction. Semantics, on the other hand, is concerned with the study of meanings in all its formal aspects. So this would include, aside from your dictionary meaning or your denotative meaning and your connotative meaning, we also have your antonyms, your synonyms, kumbaga. And we also have words which have several types of meaning. Depende sa context, depende sa interpretation ng tao, and on how the word is arranged, kumbaga. So for example, under semantics, this is where we encounter words, of course, like your antonym of your dead is alive, but of course we will make it more college level by identifying its categories or the different classifications of antonyms and synonyms. So lastly, we have your pragmatics, which is the study of language in use, kumbaga. So it deals with how speakers use language, which cannot be predicted from linguistic knowledge alone, and how hearers arrive at the intended meaning of the speakers. Like for example, there are instances na, there are instances like the husband arrives or the husband comes home and announces to the wife na ay ari na nakapuli nako, and then the wife would answer nagkaon ako. So it does not have a relation. For example, at first look or at first glance, 'di ba? Do parang um walang relation yung answer ng wife sa sinabi ng husband. So the husband only said na he is home already, and then the wife answered na I already ate. Kumbaga. So what is the hidden meaning, kumbaga, or what is the wife trying to say, or what is the wife trying to relay to the husband, kumbaga, from that situation? So it could be na nagasungod ang wife, or that may bilin pa dito nga sudaan kaon ka na kay kami tapos na, something like that, kumbaga, or na kapoy kami maghulat sa imo nagkaon na kami una, something like that. So even without saying those exact words, from the response alone, perhaps the husband could arrive to that interpretation na okay, amo nang ginamin niya. So that is under the realm of pragmatics. So next, you have your linguistic competence and your linguistic performance. So we have here first your definition about competence. So medyo na-repeat naman siya in the other slide. So I will just click through. So linguistic competence constitutes or is composed of the knowledge of a person's knowledge of language, kumbaga. So this means that people do not have conscious access to the principles and rules that govern the combination of sounds, words, and sentences, but they do recognize when those rules or principles have been violated. So it's the speaker's knowledge of the language, kumbaga. So for example, whether you're a hearer or you're a speaker, when you say something or when you hear someone say something or there's an utterance na you hear, kumbaga, ma-detect mo, although hindi mo man memorize kung ano ang mga principles and rules of a specific language, you can sense if there is something wrong with the sentence uttered or that you have uttered or you have heard. Kumbaga. So nga, ay, ano tong hambal ko man daw mali lagi to. Or if you hear someone say something, nga ay daw, the wrong grammar lagi to siya. Hindi mo balaan kung diin nga part exactly, but somehow, daw nagbagting ang talinga mo, nga ay daw ano siya, daw may something wrong sa iyang pag-word sa sentence. Linguistic performance, on the other hand, is the ability to produce and comprehend sentences naman in a language. So your linguistic performance is the actual and real use of language. Kumbaga. So um, how do we use or utilize language ba talaga in reality, for example? For example, when we are speaking, ano pa dyan? When we're writing, for example. So there are different factors that influence linguistic performance. So this is medyo madami naman and some are self-explanatory. So we will skip through the other ones if medyo understandable naman. So one of the factors that influence linguistic performance is linguistic competence or a speaker's knowledge of the language. Kunyari. So that's also a factor that could influence an individual's linguistic performance because sometimes, although we all have our linguistic competence, the levels of our linguistic competence differ from one person to another. Although perhaps there are people na medyo same-same ang ilang level of linguistic competence or at the same level ang ilang knowledge of a specific language, but then for other people it could be different. Kung ba, some are lower, some are higher, average lang yung iba medyo advanced na. So it would really show on your linguistic performance or when you use the language na mismo. Na, ay, ano ni siya ng, damo gid siya na balaan nga words or ang words niya nga mga balaan niya is um, very high level. So siguro ta palabasa ni siya nga bata, for example. Or when he or she speaks, makita mo nga very ano siya, very fluent, for example, of the language. So the nature and limitations of the speaker here, speech production and speech perception mechanism. So as I have said, di ba na there are speech disorders and sometimes in not only in disorders na kumbaga na there are people who have a hard time producing, for example, producing speech. Di ba na hindi makapronounce ng letter S, or instead of sounding out yung ang letter R na R, amo na, ila is R, amo lang nang ma-produce nilang a sound. So aside from that, so of course, that would really affect their linguistic performance because they are put at a disadvantage na, okay, nami na ang flow and then nagmali siya nang medyo obvious nga hindi gid siya maka-pronounce sa R. So syempre, if you're a listener rather, na you would really notice kumbaga nga ay may something wrong sa R niya, hindi ba siya maka-pronounce ng R? So medyo distracting siya for some na hindi pa sanay, for example, or hindi pa na used sa speaking style sang speaker nga to. So speech perception also, na for example, if there are people who have a hard time producing certain speech sounds, there are also people na who have a hard time perceiving speech sounds or hindi nila kaayo hindi nila ma-pronounce ang mga speech sounds kaya hindi nila mabatian maayo. For example, those people um, who have hearing impairments, for example. So ganon. So aside from that, the nature and limitation of the speaker here's memory, concentration, attention, and other mental capacities. So for example, sometimes when our memory is limited, medyo magpanic ta kay nga ay hala amo dapat ning hambalon ko. How come amo na lang ang ano paano na halang amo lang ni ang madumduman ko. So ano ang himuon ko sa remaining time when I speak about this. So for example, sometimes that makes us panic and throws us off kumbaga when we are speaking, for example. So when our attention fluctuates, na for example, one moment we are focused on our topic that we are talking about, and then the next, malingaw ta or may nakita ta dira habang naga-talk ta or when we are speaking or reciting, for example. And then we get distracted na ay, andi na gani ko kumbaga, ma-distract ta or ma-sidetrack. So when we make changes to our intended sentences as well, nasa imo mentally, amo na ning outline mo, okay, amo ni ang pasunod sang ako ning speech karon. And then on at the last moment, we make changes na okay, amo na lang galit ni mag-shortcut na lang ko. So sometimes that also throws us off and pag nag-change ka at the last moment lang nga habang ga-perform ka, of course, somehow it could affect your linguistic performance nga hindi na siya smooth. Nga mag-utal-utal ka na nga magbalik-balik or may malimtan na because of your last minute changes. So also for example, for those who are bilingual, so there are situations wherein the two languages interfere with each other, nga nang mag-code switching ka. For example, pag naga-code switching, medyo budlay or ma-distract nga from switching or speaking in Hiligaynon, mag-switch naman into English, kumbaga. So medyo mabudlayan kis nga, I'm talking about nang ano balahaw, like that, for example. So another is the dialectal environment of the speaker hearer and the idiolect and individual style of the speaking of the speaker hearer. So for example, if a speaker is not used to producing this specific sound, mabudlayan siya sa iyang linguistic performance if i-require siya, for example. Like in English we have there, di ba, na when we pronounce words like your BAG, bag, for example, BAT, bat, ganon. So, um, so pag ganon po, for example, wala tayong ganitong sound na sa Filipino. Sa Filipino po, for example, wala tayong ganon na sound na for example, salamat, hindi naman ganon. So it would be hard to pronounce sometimes. So we also have your speaker here's factual knowledge and view of the world in which he lives. So factual knowledge and view of the world in which he lives, like of course, your knowledge about the topic and view of the world in which he lives. Na for example, for him or for her, tama siya, syempre assertive gid siya in his or her linguistic performance. But then if along the way do wala na siya nagapati about the topic that he or she is talking about, so mag-waver siya, do medyo wala na effectivity yung speech niya mismo. Another is the speaker here's state of health, his emotional state, and other similar incidental circumstances. Like sometimes when we are speaking, or if the listeners are people that we really know, they can identify or pinpoint na ay okay, though ano lagi ni siya, though there's something different about the way he or she speaks today. Perhaps he or she is not feeling well. So we have here the definition of competence in performance according to Noam Chomsky. So what linguistic competence is what a person knows, the ability to distinguish between grammatical and non-grammatical sentences, whereas performance is the comprehension and production of language, what a person can actually produce. And as we have said or have discussed already in the past slides, that sometimes we do not produce what is in our competence because of several factors or distractions. So let's take this word, for example, multangular tower. So multangular perhaps for some is, let's take na lang na it's new to you or you are not familiar with the word multangular. So using your linguistic competence, or if you have a knowledge na when you dissect multangular into its basic units or forms, kumbaga, na what is paano ba ang daw ang combination sa multangular. So you have multi and your angle plus your AR na suffix. So that makes it angular. Kumbaga. So multi, what does multi mean? More than one or many. Damo. Angle is your corner or side. Kumbaga. So multangular, so you have there, you can connect it into, or you can connect those meanings that you have, or you have derived from your linguistic competence in order to come up with its meaning. So multi, and then your angle or your angular, so more than one side or having many sides. So it could translate to multangular tower means a multi-sided tower. Kumbaga. So that is your linguistic competence at work na it is it is working or decoding the unfamiliar word for you. Depende as well kung anong level na yung linguistic competence. So how do performance and competence apply to a language classroom? So in the traditional style of teaching pa in the past in language instruction, our teachers in the past would teach us by presenting and having us practice in a way wherein we would internalize the forms or we can memorize the forms and formulas. For example, pag aside from memorizing the subject-verb agreement rules, we are also made to familiarize or i-memorize na, okay, pag mag-form ka ng past tense of the verb, ganito, lagyan lang ng D or ED, depende. So, pag nag-end sa ganito, you just add D. Pag hindi naman, you add ED, for example. Na if present naman, ing or your letter S. If plural or if more than one, mag-add lang ng letter S. So, di ba, there are really some forms as well na we have to memorize, like your collective nouns. So, for example, your colony, ano pa dira, congregation. So, for example, school, for example, in animal, school of fish. So, your herd, ganon. Yung mga irregular verbs pa, your swim, swam, your drunk, and so on and so forth. So, although there's nothing wrong naman or we don't say, again, sorry, let me rephrase that. So, although it's not wrong na we have to memorize those forms because it is helpful naman in helping us learn the language or to speak it, for example. Ang medyo mali lang is the common assumption na if na-memorize na ng mga students yung formulas or yung forms is that it would translate or it would transfer na, mag-transfer po ang knowledge nila nga ang mga bata is mag-excel na in reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Kumbaga. So although wala nila ginhatagan activities nga ma-develop pod or nag-focus sa reading, writing, listening, speaking, gi-assume na lang na ay kay memorize na nila ang forms magamit na nila sa reading, writing, listening, and speaking. So which is wrong naman to assume. So just because gitudloan mo sila nga, okay, um, for example, Sheila plays in the park. So, himuon ta nga past tense ang place. So, what will we do? Ano ang i-erase? I-erase ang S sa place and then i-replace ang ED. So, for example, pag ganon, although it's correct, it's not a real application of your reading, writing, listening, and speaking. So, kumbaga, hindi rin na-develop yung macro skill and hindi siya assurance na transfer yung knowledge into those macro skills. So that's the disadvantage of using such approach na they are or the learners are not able to use the language in a natural way. And learners as well have difficulty reversing that kind of training or that kind of way of being taught and actually doing something with the language. Kaya ganun lang, drills lang ng sentence but not actually using it in real life context or application using the macro skills. So that's why, 'di ba, after that, for example, ng mga drills is gina-expect na ng teacher na kaya na ng bata magsulat ng ilang paragraphs ng sentences na grammatically correct. Na, okay, tapos na ta sa pag-discuss ang tenses of the verb, okay, magsulat ka mo sang essay ha, na ganito ganyan ang topic. So observe correct, na make sure na correct yung application nyo ng verbs and tenses. So the focus, kumbaga, or yung gitudlo lang is the verbs and tenses, but not on the skill or the macro skill of writing. Kaya hindi naman verbs and tenses ang gina-consider mo when you are writing, for example. So that's why it would also be difficult to assess sometimes pag ganun na nag-assessment, for example, whether the learner's insufficient proficiency is because of limitations of competency or a lack of performance. So, hindi mo ma-judge na diin ba siya nagkulang sa iya ba nga knowledge of the language, or is it on, or is there something wrong nga nagalimit sa iya nga hindi siya maka-produce or makagamit sang language the way that you expect them to. So that's why we have your communicative approach to replace your traditional way of teaching or language instruction. So your communicative approach naman concentrates or focuses on getting learners to do things with the language. So we do not say na the teacher's way in the past na teaching us about the forms to internalize or to memorize the forms and your formulas, for example, kag ang mga elements sa language is wrong, but it's not enough kung baga nga amo lang na ang obrahon. So we have to balance it as well. So learn through the language na, so students are encouraged to learn through the language by having a balanced focus on both competence and performance. So tudloan sila sa verbs or tenses of the verbs, and then give them activities wherein they can apply it na little by little, kumbaga, in the different macro skills, for example. So instead of having them write an essay right away, for example, you help them, of course, for example, you help them write little by little na you write first together. For example, you assess them na, okay, first sentence is ganito, ganyan. So, kung amo na ni ang ginobra ni na Sheila played in the park, so after that, ano pa ba ang pwedeng gawin, ganito, ganyan. So, parang collaboration as well between the teachers and the students para may idea sila na, okay, so sa writing, aside from being cautious of our tense, ganito pala dapat may transition words na gamitin, ganito dapat ang sentences are complete, ganito ang mga punctuation na gamitin, and so on and so forth. So it's balanced na, it's adding to their knowledge or to their competence, and they are using as well, they are using the language. Kumbaga. So that is for your communicative approach. So that would be all for our session or for our topic in linguistics, since we already discussed this as well in the video conference yesterday. So stay safe, God bless, and thank you, class.